It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
We are a staunch ally of Israel. We remain a staunch ally of Israel. We've made this legal judgment as a result of the process we're required to follow.
Britain suspends some arms exports to Israel. The Israeli Prime Minister calls it shameful.
I will make the Conservative Party a serious force again.
Tom Tugendhat launches his bid for the Tory leadership. And are autocrats gaining the upper hand over democracies? Our guest, Anne Applebaum, who's written about it, thinks they are. Also joining us today, Labour MP Helena Dollimore, Conservative MP and Shadow Veterans Minister Andrew Bowie, and alongside Anne Applebaum, the Conservative commentator Tim Montgomery. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome. Let's have a look at this headline from The Times to kick off the programme. National pride falls as Britain redefines itself. Pride in the country's history and democracy has dropped since 2013, alongside the proportion of people who feel only those born here can be truly British. My opening question, I'm going to start with you. Tim, what's going on here? What do you make of it?
I think one of the big things is actually the way we see ourselves as our history. There's all sorts of been criticism of our imperial history, our role in slavery, for example. And I think it's really important to be honest about that. But I think we need to see both sides. Yes, the slave trade, of which Britain was a part, was despicable. But also the Royal Navy played an incredibly important part going around the world, leading the world, actually in disassembling slave ports as well. So I think there's a lack of confidence in Britain's history that wasn't there, I think, a generation ago. But I think the way it's perhaps been taught in schools, and dare I say, sometimes on television, it hasn't always been the full picture.
You are allowed to say that, Tim. And what do you think is going on here? What reflects in those figures how Britons regard themselves and their history and their politics?
I mean, is it really just about history, or is it also about contemporary politics?
It is about how democracy works broadly. One of the statistics, only 53% now say they take pride in the way Britain's democracy works, down from 69% in 2013, and it is part of this British social attitude survey.
But surely the biggest blow to British democracy in the last decade or so, I know it's almost taboo to talk about, was the promise made that Brexit would be this transformative experience that would change the country for the better and make it more democratic. And it failed. It didn't achieve that. And then we had this series of changing prime ministers that, it wasn't a fantastic advertisement for democracy. So people's recent experience of democracy is pretty mixed.
What do you say to that, Tim?
Well, we're not going to relitigate the Brexit wars between Anne and I.
Do you agree it might have contributed?
Well, definitely one thing I think even Anne and I could agree on this is that a division came into the country on that issue. A poison entered our bloodstream that hasn't gone away. I don't think Brexit has failed. I think it's too early to tell. But what is definitely true is politics has been much more divisive since. But I would say, look at Trump-Biden, look at most European countries. There's something in the bloodstream of most Western democracies that is more divisive. So Brexit was our manifestation of that division, but we're far from unusual in something going wrong in how we debate with each other, how we talk to each other.
Right, I mean, does it matter?
Yeah, I think it does matter. It's quite sad, actually, to see that people are having less pride in the United. I think we've got a lot to be proud about. I think one of the things that comes out of that survey is that there are now fewer people who think that you need to be born here to be British. That's something that I think we should take great pride in, that we are such a welcoming, open country, open to those who want to build their lives here and make their lives here in the United Kingdom. But we've got a very proud history. Tim's spoken about the horrors of slavery, but also the role the UK had in disassembling the slave trade and everything else that this country did, standing up to Nazism, taking on communism and everything else throughout history. So I think we've got a lot to be proud about. There is obviously a moment right now, a moment of introspection, I think, as a nation, examining, who we are, where we are going. One of the reasons I'm supporting Kemi Baden, the front page of one of the papers there, she's talking about this renewal that needs to take place, not just within the Conservative Party, because I think actually our defeat, the scale of our defeat, maybe is a manifestation of where the country is right now. But we do need to examine what it is that is going wrong, why people have less pride in the United Kingdom than they maybe should, from my perspective, and how we address that and move forward.
Welcome to you, Helena, new Labour MP, onto the programme. Is this something that the newish Labour government should be doing something about?
I think, you know, Andrew and I, as of everyone, just been up and down on the doorstep for the last couple of months throughout the general election campaign, listening to thousands of people, and what comes through resoundingly from them is that people almost have a sense of hopelessness about the ability of politics to make a difference, the ability of government to improve things for the better. It's a legacy of 14 years of the Conservatives and the broken promises, the scandals that we saw under the Conservatives. And it's up to us now, I think myself, all of the new Labour MPs feel such a heavy weight of responsibility with the new Labour government to deliver the change that people have voted for. And that is why
what's going to
people have
restore
been getting
that faith? What is it that you're going to do as a Labour government to restore that faith?
I think it's about working on the issues that matter to people, putting government back in the service of working people, fixing our public services from the state they've been in. You know, when you speak to people, it's about getting a doctor's appointment, getting a dentist appointment, and having enough money to get through to the end of the month. And that is how we restore people's faith in democracy. I think when we don't act on issues like that, we leave a vacuum that more dangerous actors fill, as I'm sure we'll come on to with Anne's piece later.
Well, one of the things that the Labour government has done has suspended some arms sales of export licences to Israel, saying that there is a clear risk that the equipment or components could be used to commit serious violations of international law. Now, there's been a mixed response in today's papers. Let's just take a look at the I front page. The headline there, UK restricts sale of weapons to Israel due to clear risk of breaking international law. The Israeli Prime Minister, unsurprisingly, has unequivocally criticised the response, writing this on X: "This shameful decision will not change Israel's determination to defeat Hamas, a genocidal terrorist organisation that savagely murdered 1,200 people on October the 7th, including 14 British citizens." Do you want to respond directly to what Benjamin Netanyahu has said in that tweet?
I think, as the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary have been absolutely clear, this is about abiding by our responsibilities to uphold international law. It's a legal assessment. It's a process that is done by lawyers in the Foreign Office. They have identified a clear risk in relation to 30 export licences, which is why the government has acted. But it does not take away from the fact that Israel are a key ally of Britain. We continue to stand with Israel, as we have done since the 7th of October and since taking government, in helping them defend their right to exist, defending their right to self-defence, and working with them on a number of operations in that respect, whether it be defeating the Houthis in the Red Sea, whether it be standing with them when Iran was sending missiles in just a couple of months ago. It doesn't take away from that, and we continue to stand with Israel. And I would also point out that when you look at the legal advice from the Foreign Office, they are also clear that Hamas...
Have you seen the legal
I've read
advice?
it this morning. I read the legal advice that was published on the government website. The document is very clear that it also assesses that Hamas is a terrorist organisation that has absolutely no regard for international law, and we mustn't lose sight of that when we're discussing this issue.
Tim, you've been shaking your head.
Well, it's not often, Jo, we're just talking about national pride. It's not often that I'm really ashamed of my country. And yesterday was a real day of shame, I felt. On the day that Israel was still mourning 6 hostages who were murdered, we had the British government. Supposedly, Israel is one of our most important allies in the world. They are in the front line against Iranian-sponsored terror. Iran sponsors terrorist organisations around the world, including Hamas. And on that day, we withdrew that kind of support. And look, it's not the first time. If this was an isolated example, maybe you could justify it in a legalistic way. You can always look at legal advice in different ways. I can't quite accept that. But you know, this is from a foreign secretary who would turn up to meet Israeli officials wearing his badge showing solidarity with hostages. And then when he met Palestinian leaders, when it was most important to keep that badge on, he took it off. You know, Britain, since Labour's come to power, we've also resumed funding to UNRWA, a United Nations agency which has been proven to have had Hamas operatives within it. I'm afraid what we're seeing this, call me cynical if you like, but I absolutely believe it. We've seen Labour running scared of an Islamicist vote in Britain, and they are responding after saying they would stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel. They're running away from standing with Israel, and I think it is absolutely shameful, I'm afraid.
Yeah, right, well, Helen, do you want to respond? We're going to speak, should I just say, Zara Sultana, former Labour MP, sitting now as an independent in just a moment. But respond to that, Helena.
This is about being a government that is absolutely committed to upholding international law without fear or favour. And on day one of becoming Foreign Secretary, David Lammy commissioned this advice. When he got the advice, he's acted on it.
But Helena,
and we've made that very clear.
The optics of this, I mean, it's deeply shaming as a country. On the day that they were actually burying hostages who had been murdered by Hamas, the UK government took the decision to suspend these arms export licenses. I think that's absolutely shameful. What does that say about our relationship with Israel, a key ally in our fight against Iran, one of the few democracies in the Middle East, an upholder of freedom for its citizens? And we are saying that we're withholding arms licenses on the day that the very people that they've gone to war with Hamas for, the hostages that were taken, are being put in the ground. I think it was a deeply dispiriting moment for this country, and something that I'm very ashamed of, actually.
Was the timing wrong?
I think this was a legal process.
Yeah, but was the timing
The Foreign Secretary came to Parliament.
But answer that point, the timing of it, because it's also the former National Security Advisor, Peter Ricketts, who actually backs up the decision to actually suspend some of these licences, but not the timing.
I think every single day of this conflict since the 7th of October has been a brutal day. There is no good day to announce legal advice, and that is what the Foreign Secretary's done. But we have been consistently clear in calling for the release of all hostages. Hamas have got to do that. And myself, along with many other new MPs, met with some of the families of the hostages before the summer recess, and it was just so harrowing to hear what they're going through. And just as we talk about Hamas and how they show no regard for international law, we've got to remember what the families are going
I want to
through.
bring in Zara Sultana, because actually there are some MPs who actually don't think the government's gone far enough in terms of suspending those licences for arms exports. Zara Sultana, you are calling for all arms export licences and sales to Israel to end. Why?
Over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed, majority women and children. Over 90,000 people have been wounded, and over 10,000 people are buried in the rubble from Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza. And if the government is recognising that British-made weapons might be complicit in breaking international law, then I don't understand how we can only be suspending 30 out of 350 licenses, including components for F-35 fighter jets, which have been described by their manufacturer as the most lethal fighter jets in the world. Only yesterday, a Danish NGO confirmed that an Israeli F-35 fighter jet was instrumental during the attack on Al-Mawasi, a designated so-called safe zone on July the 19th, which killed 90 people. So on one hand, the government is saying that they are stopping arms that might be used in Gaza, except F-35 fighter jets. And it's a bit like saying you've given up gambling, except you're placing bets each way at Cheltenham.
All right, Helena?
I think we've been really clear we're upholding international law. You know, Zara is talking about the issues on the ground, but this is a legal process. Lawyers have made a legal assessment, and they have ascertained that 30 of the licences, there is a clear risk of them being used in the current conflict in Gaza. If we're talking about F-35s, it's a much broader issue. There are many different countries that draw on the F-35 supply chain, not just the current conflict in Gaza. So I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact this is a legal process. It's one that we have respected, unlike the previous government,
of course,
which did not
Helena,
act on legal advice.
Advice, and ministers do decide. But are you saying that if the Conservatives had won the election, been given this advice on this number of arms export licences, you would have just overridden it?
Well, I mean, it's not for me to say, because we are not in government anymore, and
Andrew,
you're absolutely right.
You've been shaking your head all the way through, so I presume you're saying you would.
I personally regret the decision that's been taken, but I can't speak for what the government would have done should we have won that election. But Zara Sultana did hit on an interesting point there, and Andrew Mitchell, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, made this point yesterday on X. It seems in the statement that was made yesterday that this new Labour government were seeking to placate everybody and yet failing to please anybody. And I do worry, in trying to maintain relations with Israel, trying to placate backbench Labour MPs, what they have done is actually taken the worst course of action. What signal does this send other countries around the world? This is an ally of ours. We're now saying that we're not going to be sending arms.
Part of fighting groups like Hamas, violent terrorist organizations, and part of standing up to lawless countries like Iran, as well as lawless countries like Russia, is enforcing your own law. So I have a lot of sympathy, actually, for this idea that if the Israelis are breaking rules that we set or that we would apply to any country, that, of course, we have absolutely the right to enforce that law. And that's part of resisting the rise of autocratic influence around the world and the rise of lawlessness, which we're going to get to more broadly in a minute. I mean, I have another view, which is that if there are any spare weapons available between, I don't know, Vilnius and Vancouver, they should be going to Ukraine, because it's only by breaking the power of that autocratic network that we win.
But what message does it send more broadly and more widely, like America, for example? I mean, it seems that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is impervious to influence from outside. But how are the Americans going to respond to what the UK has decided to do, not just over its arms export licences, or a number of them, but the moves that Tim was also talking about in terms of removing opposition to the International Criminal Courts, calling for Netanyahu to be arrested, and also UNRWA, the sort of Palestinian arm, if you like, of the United Nations. They've reinstated the funding.
I mean, I hate to say, I mean, I'm not sure any of those things are monumental enough to change the greater conversation. I mean, I would just add one element here, which is that some of what we're discussing are things that the Israeli opposition also want. So there's a sentiment in Israel that Netanyahu himself has become committed to staying in the war for his own reasons. That he's himself beginning to break the rule of law in Israel, and to the extent to which that we can help that argument along, I think it's all very useful.
Tim?
I think just one thing I've pushed back with a little bit to Anne on is this whole idea that there is this thing called international law that is pure. Lawyers really disagree on it quite a lot. And a lot of it is very politicised. And on the grand scheme of things, we basically have a lot of people hide behind sort of overseas interventions, really behind Beijing and Moscow, because at the moment, in the way United Nations, for example, is constituted, Beijing and Moscow have a veto on the West taking action. It's not quite so complicated with issues like the International Criminal Court. There is more of an independent process there. But let's not sort of elevate international law to sort of a godlike status,
I'm talking about
because
UK
it's
law.
very contested.
I'm talking about UK law.
But UK law is in itself partly interpretation of international law.
UK has the right to interpret its own law.
Well, and that's the case of interpretation, which is why I think Andrew would perhaps not take the same view as David Lammy if he did.
Well, let me come back to Zara Sultana, because you will have heard criticism at the opposite side to you, actually saying that this move by the UK and this general shift in policy, even if, as Anne said, it's not monumental in terms of materially changing the course of the war, but it could risk emboldening Hamas in thinking that support is beginning to move away from Israel. Is that a dangerous thing, Zara?
The UK seeks to uphold international law as well as domestic law, and there are legal challenges by organisations like Al-Haq and the Global Legal Action Network taking the UK government to court on arms sales. So if we are to talk to other countries and say that we respect international law, we have to also make sure that we are not complicit in breaching international law and violating human rights across the world, and therefore suspending all arms sales would make that quite loud and clear.
Right. I mean, should Labour look now seriously, the government, at just stopping all arms sales to Israel on the basis that if there is a risk of breaching international law with this small number of arms export licences, why not all of them?
Well, the advice is very clear in that it identifies 30 licences where there is a risk of it being used in the current conflict in Gaza. I think there's different panellists are saying different things about what they want the advice to say, but the fact is the Foreign Secretary has been presented with the legal advice. You can't be presented with the legal advice you want to be presented with. You have to act on it.
He makes a decision and then he acts, and he's taken the decision to interpret this advice in a certain way, which has led to the decision that was published yesterday. And my big concern is the signal this sends, not just Israel, but other countries in the region and indeed around the world, about the UK's commitment to Israel and to the defeat of Hamas as a terrorist organisation.
He's taken the decision to act on the advice in front of him. He's taken the decision to follow international law, something that the previous government often shied away from. And more broadly, he's been absolutely clear in the Commons yesterday, on the media round this morning, that we continue to stand with Israel as a key ally.
That's absolutely fine.
We continue to support them in their right to self-defence, and we're using every diplomatic lever that we have as a new Labour government to bring about that peaceful solution, to get all the hostages released, to bring about the ceasefire. We are working towards that with our international allies, and that's, we mustn't lose sight of that in this discussion.
Helena, as Anne said, it's not going to make a material difference. This war is going to continue, despite moves by the Labour government here in the UK. So is it performative? Is it political? Is it to quieten left-wing MPs who are echoing the sorts of things that Zara Sultana is saying, even though she is sitting as an independent?
I think we must never lose sight of the prospect of bringing about a peaceful solution. I think things become very dangerous when we start talking in terms of conflicts not being solvable and not going on. I think we can find a solution here. I think we can get the parties to the table. We can get all sides to stop the fighting. We mustn't lose sight of that and stop working towards that.
Zara, are you feeling more comfortable sitting as an independent rather than part of Keir Starmer's Labour Party?
I'd just like to come back on one point.
Yeah, but answer that question first and then you can come back.
I refuse to see this in a factional way. This is not about the left or the right of the Labour Party. 56% of the British public back a full arms ban on sales to Israel. And that's what we need to remember. 40,000 Palestinians have been killed. And we need to reflect on that before we make this a political football between the right and the left of the Labour Party.
And are you more comfortable sitting as an independent? Would you be attracted to the idea of joining Jeremy Corbyn, the former Labour leader's new group? I think it's Independent Alliance.
From the Labour Party for wanting to scrap the two-child benefit cap, which would lift 330,000 children from poverty. And I've been championing those causes.
Yes.
Up for international law, and that's what I'll continue to do.
Right. And so are you hoping to get back into the Labour Party and have the whip restored in a couple of months' time?
I'm going through the process with the Labour Party. I'm still a Labour Party member. I'm still paying my subscriptions, and I'm going through the process.
Zara Sultana, thank you very much for joining us. Well, let's talk about the ongoing row between the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and the Shadow Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. It rumbles on about the truth of the £22 billion black hole that Labour say they have inherited, and they didn't know about it, they have inherited from the last Conservative government. We can talk to the BBC's chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman. What's happening? Because they're in, I think, both of them, aren't they, in the Commons at the moment, or there have been Treasury questions, and no doubt this has been part of it.
Absolutely, Jo. They're facing off in the House of Commons right now, but they also faced off in the House of Commons just before MPs broke up for the summer. And that was where Rachel Reeves, for the first time, made this claim that she had inherited a £22 billion black hole from Jeremy Hunt and from Rishi Sunak's government. Jeremy Hunt was furious at the time. One of the things that he did as he contested that claim was he wrote a letter to Simon Case, he's the head civil servant, the Cabinet Secretary, suggesting that by going along with Rachel Reeves's claims, the civil service was essentially being brought into disrepute. And I've been leaked today Simon Case's response to that, where he insists that the civil service has behaved appropriately at all times, but also then goes on to essentially criticise the previous government that he was serving until just a couple of months ago, suggesting that their failure to update departmental budgets since 2021 was a big reason for what he calls sizable in-year changes to spending plans. I mean, that's very sort of civil service speak for actually really quite wide variation in what the government was spending over certain periods of time. Now, they've picked up that debate in the House of Commons this afternoon. Just have a listen now to Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, taking a go at the previous government's economic record.
My honourable friend is absolutely right to remind us of the dire inheritance that this government has faced. Spending commitment after spending commitment, absolutely no idea of how to pay for it. From road and rail projects to A-levels to the Rwanda deal, £22 billion of unfunded commitments that the last government had no idea how to pay for. We will fix the foundations of this economy, rebuild Britain and ensure working people are better off fixing the mess that the last government left.
So, Henry, yes, we could see a very cross Jeremy Hunt there shouting back at Rachel Reeves as she delivered that statement or part of it. Now, we've got another 8 weeks of this, haven't we, until the budget. And great, what a thing to look forward to.
Well, another 8 weeks of Rachel Reeves talking about the tough decisions that she says she's going to make. Another 8 weeks, I'm sure, of Jeremy Hunt vigorously contesting the notion that there is a black hole in the first place. But I'm afraid it's not just 8 weeks that you're going to be dealing and listening to this claim and counterclaim and counterclaim and so on. I think this really gets to the core of what is going to be perhaps the biggest question of the next few years. What was the nature of the economic inheritance that this new Labour government was left by its Conservative predecessor? And then going forwards, what tax and spend decisions is Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer going to make in response? Are they fair, and can they grow the economy, which of course Keir Starmer says is the central defining mission against which his government should be judged?
Henry Zeffman, thank you very much. It's a pretty poor inheritance, isn't it? A £22 billion black hole that we can use the jargon in-year spending, stuff that was committed, there was no money behind it, and that's what you've left this Labour government.
No, we haven't, frankly. We had a budget in the spring, we had a fully costed manifesto, and all of our commitments were fully funded, fully costed. The fact
There's
is
no spending review, according to Simon Case.
The economy was in a difficult place. Everybody acknowledges that. Everybody around that was involved in the election, commentators, experts, economists, politicians, ministers, acknowledged that the economy was in a difficult place as we recovered from the pandemic and from the impact that the war on Ukraine had on the British economy. But what we actually left, the inheritance that this Labour Party took from us, was the fastest growing economy in the G7, inflation down towards 2%, which is the Bank of England's target, and unemployment at record low levels. So this is a very good inheritance on which they can build. Since they've come into office, the Labour government have taken the decision to reward striking public sector workers, a 22% increase if you're a junior doctor, a 16% increase if you're a striking train driver, with no commitment to reform their working practices. And so they've got to answer as to why they've taken those decisions, putting further strain on the economy, whilst at the same time removing winter fuel allowance from hundreds of thousands of pensioners, some of whom who are going to lose it, are on less than half of the minimum wage. It's absolutely obscene, frankly.
Helena, do you want to respond?
I think my constituents in Hastings and Rye would be quite shocked to hear what Andrew is saying. This country has just resoundingly rejected the Conservatives.
Well,
we were the only party, Labour was the only party that went into the election with a fully funded, fully costed manifesto. We knew we were going to have perhaps the worst inheritance of any government in modern history, but what we found, the true extent of it, is shocking. As you heard the Chancellor saying in the House of Commons, black holes, unfunded commitments, the £22 billion black hole. We've been really clear. We're going to take the tough decisions. They're not going to be easy decisions.
You're going to cut spending, and you are probably going to have to borrow money.
We're going to stick to the commitment that we made in the election, not to raise taxes on working people. The Chancellor's been very clear about that.
There are plenty of others.
I'm not going to sit here and write the budget. The Chancellor will do that on the 30th of October, and you'll have to wait for that. But we've been really clear we're going to stick to those principles, and we're not going to shy away from decisions that the Tories did. The mess they've left us is because they've shied away from these decisions.
Just briefly over here, Tim. Look, I did this yesterday. In fact, I did it before the summer recess. Look, the coalition government in 2010 set the scene. You know, you've broken the country, you didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining. I mean, it's a narrative that is, well, that's successful. It was then, and it probably will be now.
Absolutely. And to be fair to Labour, the inheritance is grim. The reality, I think, is that I think it's true across most of Europe and the Western world. There was this thing called the pandemic. We moved on from it very quickly. It's left the public finances of most European countries in a terrible state. Now, the reality, of course, is that Labour wanted Britain to lock down deeper and longer, and so it would have been worse. But what I'm confused about Labour's position at the moment is their inheritance is definitely grim. They're telling the truth about that. But their message was growth. But you don't get growth if you increase taxes, if you cancel infrastructure projects, and you introduce really controversial workplace red tape. What I don't understand is, yes, they've got this grim inheritance, but where are they going to get the growth from? That's the thing that's missing ingredient.
And plummeting confidence from businesses in this government's ability to actually create the growth.
I can link this back to the conversation about national pride, if you want.
Do.
You have to be a really rich country to lose £22 billion. I mean, think about it.
It is quite a rich country. and it's not going to be under the sofa, is it, or behind the sofa? Or
and you have a Prime Minister called Liz Truss.
Well,
that
let's
help, yeah?
That too.
let's bring politics back to today because this tweet from Neil Duncan Jordan, new Labour MP for Poole, I think the first Labour MP for Poole, has tabled this motion on the winter fuel payment. You brought this up, Andrew, and he is asking other MPs to show their support. What he's saying in that early day motion underneath is he's calling on the Labour government to delay the introduction of this. In other words, scrapping the winter fuel payments to millions of pensioners, means testing it, because it wasn't announced. There hasn't been any preparation for it. Will you join him?
We've been really clear, the winter fuel allowance decision that the Chancellor has made has not been an easy one. It's not a decision that she or any of us came into politics to make decisions like that. But the reality of the economic situation in front of us means we've got to take these decisions. We're not going to do what the Conservatives did, which is lie to the British public about the true state of the finances and not put our economy on a firm footing.
You're not going to join
No.
him and
So you're
support
not
this.
going to do
All right,
the
but I would
was
just
to
say-
reduce
Well, no, hang
pensioner
on,
poverty and to ensure that pensioners were able to heat their homes in winter. That's what we achieved by introducing the triple lock and ensuring that in every single manifesto we committed to ensuring the winter fuel allowance remained. Interesting, this announcement came on the same day that the spurious claim of the £22 billion black hole, but there wasn't a commitment to maintain the winter fuel allowance in the Labour Party manifesto. So obviously they had been considering this decision for some time. I think we introduced an early day motion as the first process to seeking to oppose this decision a few weeks ago. We look forward to voting on it hopefully in the next few weeks. I think it's an awful decision, and the optics of announcing on the same day as you're increasing by 22% some public sector.
Just on supporting
very
pensioners,
briefly, because we need to move on.
we are protecting the triple lock. That means a lot to pensioners in my constituency, and we're working to get our public services, particularly our NHS, back on its feet.
So
that will make a huge difference.
Hang on, Andrew, we're going to move on.
Okay.
Because we're going to talk about something completely different, and that's your book, Anne, Autocracy Inc. Explain, obviously, the thesis of the book sort of briefly-ish, but the ink is the interesting bit, because from what I have seen and what I've heard you say in other interviews, is this is sort of a club, if you like, of autocratic nations, underpinned not by an individual necessarily, but by their collaboration in various countries about their hatred for democracy.
Yes, the book describes a network, and what's unusual about it with our 20th century history in our heads is that it's not linked by ideology. So we're talking about communist China, nationalist Russia, theocratic Iran, Bolivarian socialist Venezuela, North Korea, a group of countries who don't share a common vision. They don't have the same language. They don't have the same aesthetics. Nevertheless, they have a set of common interests. Some of them are financial, some of them are military, but really their primary interest and the thing that really unites them is their dislike of us. And by us, I mean, Tim and you and everybody in the studio and probably people watching. What they dislike is the ideas and language of the liberal democratic world, by which I mean the rule of law, by which I mean human rights, by which I mean transparency, accountability, because those, of course, that's the language of their own internal opposition, and those are the things that threaten their particular form of kleptocratic total power. And they have begun to work together both to repress their own dissidents, but also to extend their repression around the world, whether it's taking down Irish airplanes from the sky in Belarus, or whether it's murdering people in London. They've begun to pursue people, and they've also begun to work together in particular ways. And we see this most clearly, it became most obvious in the war in Ukraine, as the Iranians help arm the Russians with drones, and then North Koreans send ammunition, and the Chinese provide components for the Russian defense industry. And so they begin to work together, mostly in opportunistic ways, but with a lot of consistency.
How do you, and what do you do about it?
Well, first of all, you recognize it, and you name it, and you understand what it is. And you stop seeing the world like we all like to do as, there's a Middle East piece, and there's a Russia piece, and there's something happening in Africa. I mean, these are, the Chinese don't see the world that way, so why should we look at it? I mean, there is a contest of ideas going on, whether we want it to be going on or not. And then there are things that we can do inside our own societies, I think. I mean, we can, the kleptocracy part of the story. We can fix our own systems. We can stop. We can prevent money laundering. We can shut down, the offshore world. I mean, we can begin to make it harder for for I mean, we're talking, another thing that's different about this group of autocrats is this is a group of billionaires. We can make it harder for them to steal and launder their money through our societies.
Right, I mean, there have been moves by successive governments to stop or limit or sanction the sort of people that you are talking about. And yet, there have also been moves and messages to China and to Russia at various points over the last few decades of wanting to embrace them, or at least get a little closer, or, you know, increase trade. Are we to blame, in part?
I think that partly we have been too greedy. But let me be I don't want to be too soppy with Anne, but one of the things that's true is that there's been internal divisions. Anne and I have fought a little bit. I've said things on Twitter that haven't been always complimentary to Anne, and we need to, you know, the Brexit, there have been debates. We began with talking about, you know, racism in the UK and things. There have been internal divisions that sometimes I think have allowed us to get in the way of what Anne writes about so powerfully, is that we actually have some really big enemies in the world at the moment. We're lucky to have grown up in an era when the West has had technological, military and economic superiority. We can't assume that will always be the case. And somehow, yes, the differences that exist between us on our history, on Brexit, they're real. We shouldn't shove them under the carpet, and they're not irrelevant to this debate. But actually, we need to be less insular. We need to be less focused on our domestic politics and recognise the sort of stuff that Anne talks about, the real enemies we face. We need to get real about it. And certainly the Tory leadership race that's happening at the moment, talking much more seriously about higher defence spending, that's certainly one of them. International law, another component. There's been lots of links, accidentally or deliberately, Jo, in this programme that all add up. Yeah. But focusing on our top foes and getting over some of our internal differences really does matter, actually.
But can you impose values of democracy?
That is not my argument. Right. I'm not calling for us to impose values of democracy.
Well, that's, yeah.
No, I'm not. I'm talking about looking at our own politics. I'm talking about creating a network of democracies and others who want to cooperate with us to fight. It's not about fighting autocracies. It's not a Cold War. It's about fighting autocratic behaviors, whether they're inside our societies or whether they're elsewhere.
Right. I mean, when you talk about that, for some people, some viewers, I mean, I'm guessing here, might look back to the sort of era of liberal interventionism, the sort of foreign policy, which a lot of people would say were disasters in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, you know, is that the sort of thing? I know you're talking about a collaboration of democracies and perhaps investing money in things that you would say would sort of spread the message. But does it also result in a doctrine of liberal interventionism?
No, I'm not. I mean, there could be moments when we need to act militarily, as we have done in Ukraine. I'm not saying, but no, this is not an argument for liberal interventionism. It's not an argument that we need to fight a new Cold War, because that's not the situation. That's not the world as it presents itself. It's an argument about remembering who we are, what our values are, working together with other countries who share those values. And recognizing how they're being challenged.
Right. I mean, David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, talks about progressive realism. What does that mean?
I think it's about not just looking inward, but looking outwards, recognising that as one country alone, there are many problems when we look around the world that we can't solve alone, be it climate change, be it the various conflicts that we need to end, be it the global migration crisis as well. I think it's about looking at where we can work with allies, increasing that, particularly when we face such dangerous enemies, as Anne's pointed out in her book, but also thinking about the world and the new threats we face that we didn't face 20, 30 years ago. Misinformation, social media age. Look at how that affected the events we saw in the UK just last month with the riots and how that, increased division. And then, on the other hand, remembering there's reasons to be hopeful, the way people came together after that, the people around the world standing up for democracy and making the most ultimate sacrifices to do that still give you reasons to be hopeful and to stand up for what we believe in.
Andrew?
The recent protests in Iran, for example, a good demonstration of that. I think we just need to be one of the answers is to be much more vocal and positive about liberal democracy and what we stand for. It looks all the way back to the very first discussion we had on this programme about pride in this country. But it's not just this country, it's pride in what used to be called the Western world and what liberal democracy stands for. And I think we can be proud. And there is an argument that liberal interventionism does have a place. I think one of the things that has emboldened the autocrats of the world, certainly Russia in recent years, was the failure of the West to intervene in Syria when it was proven that Assad used chemical weapons against his own people. The decision of the United States, Great Britain and others not to intervene in that instance, I think, did embolden autocrats around the world to think, oh, well, we can get away with what before the US, the UK, NATO and others would have taken action on. And yes, nobody can argue that Iraq and Afghanistan were not unmitigated disasters, but there were successes. Kosovo, Sierra Leone. So we need to be, I think, far more open to the idea of intervention again moving forward, so as to ensure that the autocrats of the world don't think they can get away with things which, frankly, they should not be allowed
in
to.
Keeping our promises, I think you can draw a bit of a line from the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the shambolic withdrawal from Afghanistan, and then Russia feeling emboldened to invade Ukraine.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, I don't like the expression liberal interventionism because it makes everybody think of George W. Bush and, we need to invade somebody and enforce democracy. But should we, as you say, stand by our friends? Should we stand by our values? Yes, of course. And will that mean sometimes, a military? Actually, there's not a military intervention in Ukraine. We're not fighting in Ukraine, but we are helping the Ukrainians defend themselves.
You mentioned George W. Bush. He, of course, famously linked North Korea, Iran, Saddam Hussein, and Iraq. Is that essentially similar to what you're doing here?
So I think the argument has moved on. He talked about an axis, but I think it's much more. It's much more developed now. They have, the state companies of one country invest in the state companies of another. I think they share technology, they share surveillance technology, they share, internet manipulation technology of the kind you were just talking about. And I also think it's a much wider group of countries. And they rescue one another. The autocratic world has kept, for example, a Venezuelan regime in power that would have fallen a long time ago, had it not been for its support from Russia, China, and strangely Iran, which has nothing to do with Venezuela historically or geographically, but helps the Venezuelans avoid sanctions.
Well, Tim, you mentioned the Tory leadership contest, which is ongoing, doesn't finish until November the 2nd. You saw in the headlines Tom Tugendhat, Shadow Security Minister, as we've been talking about things defence. Let's have a listen to what he had to say, or part of it, from his launch.
I didn't learn in Westminster, but in the army. And I won't be playing politics. I know that integrity matters. So I want to start with an apology. The Conservative Party owed you better. Politics is not a game.
What do you make of Tom Tugendhat? An apology there for what has gone before, or part of it.
Well, I'm backing Tom personally. I think we have 6 very good leadership candidates. If Andrews Comey, his candidate, wins, I'll be happy too. But Tom, for me, that apology really matters. We really did let down the country incredibly badly. We were like a soap opera. We did things we said we wouldn't, and vice versa. And why, I'm sure the thought of this contest going on for another 2 months probably bores the tears and frustrates a lot of your viewers. But it really matters we have an extended contest to really understand why we failed so badly. I don't think it's just a Conservative problem. We already referred, globally. There's barely a Western government in the world that is functioning particularly well at the moment. We are seeing huge shifts in popularity of in most political parties around the Western world. There's something wrong with how we govern at the moment. I think there's too much politicisation, there's too much short-termism, and I think the apology that Tom made today is a beginning of, I hope, what will be a really deep soul-searching for the Conservative Party, and we all need to do it as all Democrats. Why doesn't politics seem to work anymore? Why are people turning to populist parties like in Thuringia in Germany at the weekend? People are rejecting what they see as a political class that seems only interested in short-term fixes rather than really difficult, serious problems. And I think Tom is the candidate to sort of begin to address that.
What do you make of that point? Why people are attracted, particularly now, at the moment, in states like Thuringia and possibly Saxony, to parties like Alternative for Deutschland?
There's a whole set of reasons, and some of them do have to do with. I think there's been Russian propaganda in Germany, especially in that part of Germany, very prevalent for a decade. The Germans never took it seriously, never thought of, and this narrative about we need peace in Ukraine and so on, and we need to end the war was a part of the was a part of the election. But I think there is a deeper set of issues. You know, look, we live in a time of unbelievable change. Social change, demographic change, political change, economic change. The nature of information has changed. You know, there's an enormous amount of upheaval. And always in history, when you have times of upheaval, people want some kind of security, stability, a single message, one messenger. You know, you see this reversion.
Yeah.
This is when you get nostalgia of the kind that we've seen, you know, and when you get this desire for something simple.
You are supporting Kemi Baden.
I am
We only
indeed.
have a few seconds, and that's fixed.
That's
you're not
fixed.
changing your mind.
No,
You're not
that's
going to listen to the
No,
hustings.
and I think what's interesting, the apology from Tom, Kemi's message about renewal, the examination, we are having this discussion.
We've got PMQs
Barely.
tomorrow. Join me at 11:15.